Howdy, Portland.
Yes. Stay a while and listen.
So what do you guys want to hear? Do you want to hear more our biographical riffing, or have you come armed with like Q&A stuff? More a mix of both?
We can give you a backgrounder briefly on both of us and our.
We were thinking of working through chronologically, and then like first third Matt, second third me, the other Matt, and then the last third we'll save for questions.
I think we'll do that. Anyway, I'm Matt Householder over here at this end, and that's Matt Uelmen.
Hello.
I've been involved in game design and production since 1981, in coin-op originally. My first game that had any hint of being an action role-playing game was the coin-op Krull that I designed and programmed with a partner for Gottlieb. It was released in 1983 based on the movie Krull.
The glaive?
The glaive, yeah, the five pointed. And he claps. Yay!
Yay,
It's
Krull.
minimally an action role-playing game in that there's lots of action. It's minimally role-playing, I suppose, in that you assemble a weapon in your first quest. You find the 5 pieces of glaive and carry out a kind of series of quests in the 5 sub-games. Anyway,
They may not necessarily know that in that era you were one of the classic development founding fathers, though, and that you had like fathers and mothers, and that you had 4 or 5 different skills that you kind of brought to what you were doing in terms of like you did a little bit of coding, you did a little bit of art.
yeah, I did some of the
That's a
art.
big part of the development in that
I
era.
did some of the art. I did the font anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of what I think that era of development.
It was graph paper and IBM PCs with a development system on it. And there was no network, so my programming partner, we got together every week or so and merged our code sitting side by side in a kind of pair programming method.
But you really did all 5 categories of game development. You did the coding,
Yeah.
you did the art,
Design.
you did the design, you did the verbiage when it came out, and probably a tiny bit of localization,
Oh, yeah, I
possibly.
did all the writing.
And then production. So a lot of times the way games development has changed over the past 40 years, I think, is those 5 roles being in one person, like this person next to me. It's an unusual person that can do that well.
I didn't do the audio. Dave Thiel did all the audio. He was the guy who was famous for making audio in Hubert.
Right? You know a good story about that, actually.
Well, maybe
About
they want to hear about that. I have a lot of stories, but to kind of skip ahead to where my next exposure to the action role-playing genre would have been when I became a game producer at Epix, and I was assigned the EPYX. This was in the mid-'80s, early '80s, and I worked on the Macintosh version of Rogue, which was an inspiration for Diablo.
A very direct inspiration. Angband was the iteration that Dave Braddock played a ton of.
I was producer on that. I wasn't a developer in any way, but I was responsible for making sure that it had quality and shipped, and it didn't crash too much.
Which was more or less exactly what your job was 15 years later on a roguelike game.
Yeah, that's right. And that was at Epix, and then I was producer on a number of their big hits at Epix, the game series. So Winter Games, starting with Winter Games, I was producer on that, and somewhat of a designer, but not much. Then I was a designer, producer on World Games, and then I was creator, along with my wife Candy, who's seated in the front row, of California Games. And
Selling the California lifestyle to the
that
world.
was, right.
We all
Selling that
surf
to the rest
all
of
the time.
Folks back east. That was a huge hit for Epix, of course. But then and it's kind of a hard thing to describe, but eventually I left Epix. Epix had some ups and downs, and then mostly downs. And I ended up at a small company called DTMC, which is based in Hong Kong, doing Nintendo and Genesis titles for the U.S. market. I was the VP of product development, and one day, we had California games too, anyway, and that was one of my main jobs, was to get that done on the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Anyway, one day, a guy calls me up out of the blue and wants to talk about doing music and sound. And it was this guy, Matt Uelmen.
Say boy.
He just cold called me, and he'd gotten my name from Nintendo of America. I guess he pestered them enough.
I got a document, and I methodically went through all the Bay Area developers that were on a Nintendo thing, which was a pretty short list in terms of people that were actual developers and not just front offices for other developers or front offices for a Japanese developer. And one of those developers was
DTMC. And at that time, we were going out of business.
Well, the economy was horrible in '93 in general. I graduated in '93 into a really kind of organically bad economy before we got smarter at manipulating things by printing money at 0% back in 1993. And so things were slow in Greater San Jose. And I knew tech was about to go crazy just because everything was kind of lining up for it. But it was a slow time. That recession stung a little bit in the Bay Area. Tech was slower, real estate, stuff like that was slower for a couple of years.
Yeah, so anyway, so Matt called me. I said, well, I can't really help you with anything, but, and I said, do you have any experience? And his answer was kind of briefly, no.
No, none.
And I kind of like, well, let me think about it. Can you play any instruments? It's like, yeah, I can play the piano and guitar. And I said, and he told me, I played guitar. I played the piano in a hotel lobby for tips in Washington, D.C.
That was actually a real job. And can I say that they didn't tax me? I think, they bust me 30 years later. That was a great job. I got $15 an hour back in the early 90s in D.C. for that hotel gig. But it was like a good, $20-30 a week for a starving college student that was eating Taco Bell burritos. It was great. It was a great job.
So I figured, you can make a living.
Only lasted a year.
You're okay with that? Okay, great. You'll be fine for video games.
Exactly.
You'll be living high on the hog.
The right attitude for our corner of the entertainment industry.
Yeah. Right. Audio adds so much to games. It's such a low budget item, but it adds fully half of the audio visual experience. I believe it just creates so much in the mind of the listener player.
Well, have we given enough love to? In the history Matt just gave there, you didn't mention it, but there's 5 or 6 platforms that kind of came and went, and all that time going from '83 up through 92. There was a lot of the Atari 5200 came and went and died, and the American industry kind of died was kind of buried with ET for a good 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, until Nintendo NES resurrected.
Right.
Well, there was the Commodore. Well, there was the home computer crash too. Apple II, Commodore 64.
Yeah, so from the perspective of the early 90s, when I was entering the business, if you were trying to look at games and what they were, it was kind of Nintendo and Sega were kind of the two domineering twin gods of games. They had kind of risen up from the ashes of what was a pretty much crushed into oblivion American development scene with the death of Atari. When Bobby Kotick bought the rights to the Activision name in '93, he bought it for a couple $100,000 in debt, right?
It was 91.
91, right? The very
working,
bottom, very
I was
bottom.
working at Activision until 90, I think.
But what Kotick bought was just the name and zero of the assets, right? Theoretically the rights.
He bought it on the cheap and then took it bankrupt and moved it to Santa Monica, right? Is that right?
That sounds about right. You know that's actually a really important kind of moment in real American history, in that around that time he was hanging out with Steve Wynn, the Las Vegas Titan, trying to impress him as the smart kid that knew what the next big industry was. And you know what? He was that. Bobby Kotick was like Steve Wynn of the subsequent 20 years.
Yeah.
And that's where that money came from, to buy the rights to that name and kind of close that chapter out in video game history.
Yeah, I still have 2 shares of Activision stock from working there. I actually used to have 37 shares, and they did a reverse split after they went. Anyway,
We'll talk about Acclaim stock.
So, Matt and I like to live. I mean, we used to commute together to Blizzard and talk like this back
In your old Rabbit that would get
the
like
diesel
50
Rabbit.
miles to the gallon.
Yeah.
We were super duper green. We were country when country wasn't cool. On the Rabbit, on the 101.
Yeah, my ears still ring from that thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, I met Max Schaefer and Eric Schaefer, 2 of the creators of Diablo, while I was working at DTMC, I believe, or maybe it was at Epix just before that. But they had a game they were developing called Gordo 106, the mutated lab monkey that had been on the Atari Lynx. I'm not sure if it ever shipped.
We were also about 40 or 50 years ahead of the curve on animal rights there.
Yeah, it was
so
an animal.
Good for them.
Animal rights.
I wasn't on the team at that
game.
point.
And DTMC was looking for another title, so we contracted with them. I had met them through my wife Candy as well, so she's instrumental in my knowing Max and Eric and ever working on Diablo. So, yeah. So I met Max and Eric and got them a contract with DTMC to convert Gordo 106 to the Super Nintendo, which we never completed because DTMC went out of business before that happened. But while I was working with Max and Eric, and Dave Brevik had been with them but had left because that company had missed payroll.
That's an interesting crossover, actually. Well, he left that company because he did not want to move to Austin with Iguana. He wanted to stay in the Bay Area, but that was a related story.
Yeah, really. Anyway, so Max, Eric, and Dave had actually worked together before, and but I met Max and Eric before I met Dave. After they had split the first time from, I think it was a company called FM Waves.
Yeah, FM Waves.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, but Max and Eric, I met them. They were 2 brothers.
They still are.
Yeah.
They still live together.
And I gave them some work. And then one day I was at DTMC and Max said, "Hey, Matt." I said to Matt Uelmen, "Well, you should try to get a job with Condor." That was Max, Eric, and Dave Schaefer's company because they might need audio. So Matt eventually worked them long enough, I guess.
I bugged them for like.
To convince them.
I bugged them for like 5 or 6 months. They offered me a really mediocre salary for Silicon Valley in that time, and I took it happily. And yeah, that was. But that was when things were really slow. I was very happy to have that work, just because it was really hard. It's always been hard to like get any kind of salary going, I think, in any aspect of showbiz. But it was particularly hard in that time because the Valley was slow, and Nintendo and Sega really seemed like these kind of big imposing monoliths that you just could not really crack into unless maybe you did like a 2 or 3 years on the QA side and kind of hoped to kind of bust your way through. It was I knew the gaming was going to be big, but it seemed very hard to like walk in through the front door to it. And I had no qualifications in any case, to walk in through the front door.
Sure. So, Matt ended up there through his own efforts after finding his way through me and Nintendo before that. But Max came to me and said, "Hey, Matt, we're going to pitch you a game. It's called Diablo." That was while I was at DTMC. And I said, "Well, gee, this looks great." He showed me the pitch packet, with a budget and a game description and the game had already been named by Dave Brevik, who grew up near Mount Diablo.
Well, there was this character in Angband, was it?
Oh, was it Angband?
Yeah.
North? Yeah. But he grew up near Mount Diablo in Contra Costa County, so Diablo was on his mind from an early age. Anyway, they pitched it to me. I said, this would be great. I think it sounds really cool, but DTMC is going out of business, so don't sign anything with me. I'm not going to sign anything with you because you need to go find somebody else to fund this. So they eventually did find Knowledge Adventure to fund.
Right, Bob Davidson.
Yeah, which was the owner of Blizzard Entertainment at the time, although I think they were called Silicon and Synapse or something.
Davidson and Associates bought them out, I think when they still were I forget the timeline if Mike and Alan changed the name before or after they actually signed the deal with Jen and Bob. And you should mention another personality. If you're here, you obviously enjoyed these deep 90s cuts of history, and that's Trip Hawkins, who actually is a very important person in 80s game history. He pretty much was the person that created the Madden formula and pretty much laid the foundation for the Madden and FIFA endless cash cow that's kind of one of the big pillars underneath this industry for the past 30 years. And he was your boss at 3DO, which is kind of a forgotten chapter, but an important one.
Once DTMC went bankrupt, shortly thereafter, I had to get another job with health insurance. There was no Obamacare yet, so you need health insurance, especially when you have an infant.
Obama was hanging out in Occidental College smoking doobies, as I recall, right? At that period. Which is a wonderful school. That's an okay thing to do.
And anyway, I joined 3DO as a producer, produced some games there, and things were, that was not not my favorite place to work. But they had a pretty big budget, and I signed a contract with Max at Condor for a game called M2 Football. That was the working title.
Right.
It was going to be the premier launch title on the new M2 hardware, the second version, the Model 2 of the 3DO multiplayer hardware. It was a super high performance 3D machine with a big 3D rendering engine.
And they would never, Trip Hawkins would never have done a somewhat bogus demo just to get a lot of money from investors overseas. That's not the kind of ethics we're talking about, right?
Well,
that never happened.
Well, I do know that it was important for 3DO's future that it get the M2 with some software that could demonstrate its capabilities and get in further investment. And so basically, I was the guy doing that. Max had two guys working on it. I think it was Brian Pilton, the programmer, and Kelly Johnson, artist, doing 3D models and programming on this M2 hardware. There were like 3 of them.
And a lot of design stuff. Kelly kind of foresaw, Kelly Johnson's a really important person in Blizzard North history, and this is the project that kept the company alive when we were making the original Diablo in terms of paying for it, in terms of keeping the rent paid in the marina there.
Yeah, when Max said, "Hey Matt, can I have some money?"
But that game was basically NFL but NBA jams, and that was a lot of the creative talent of Kelly Johnson in that, and he kind of saw 3v3 or 4v4 NFL personality-driven game.
3 or 4 versus 4. I forget.
Right, which is I think the Madden franchise is just doing now as a concept. I think that's just now kind of coming in as an NFL with an NFL license.
Yeah, it was internally pitched and developed as with the working title of NFL Jam. NBA Jam had just kind of come out, and we said, well, we're going to do an NFL Jam.
But I think it was pretty far ahead of its time when it was personality focused. It was like a 3v3 or a 4v4 kind of experience with little celebration routines. There's a lot of I think the stuff that people that played those Blizzard North games really enjoyed came from the same kind of creativity that Kelly had on that project in terms of just kind of rethinking things.
Yeah.
And it kept the lights on in that period too.
Yeah, I mean 3DO was not great about keeping their ends of the contract bargain with Condor at the time, so it was easy enough for me to rewrite the milestones and kick loose some money when Max, Dave, and Eric and Diablo needed it.
There was a much bigger contract than Diablo, in terms of the actual number, if I recall correctly.
Oh, yeah, I don't really know, but I believe that I may have directed more money through Condor during that period of development than
I think that
Knowledge Adventure did.
I think that money was there in the first place because Trip Hawkins worked Wall Street really well when they did the 3DO IPO back in 94, 95, even though they never really came close to having a console that, especially in a slowish economy, people could have bought. Because they were trying to sell 3DOs for $700 in 1994, and the only real game they had was the thing where you kill the aliens over Las Vegas. Is it System Shock?
tried to block all of that out of my head.
It's hard. It's hard to get a console out there. The console business has always been really, really brutal because it's really hard to get a chunk of plastic out there for the equivalent of like a few $100, where like a middle-class parent won't sweat getting it for Christmas, and to get tons and tons of content to go with it. That's hard. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's not an easy business at the time.
It's a lot of different elements that have to be there, and that's kind of, and part of the early Blizzard North experience was seeing Sega try to play that game and just miserably fail and go down in ashes. A lot of what we saw of the experience of Blizzard North was being on the peninsula there in that era, having Twin Dolphin Drive, having Sega two stops north on the 101, because it is the 101. All freeways, the 101, D5, and that's true in Seattle, that's true in LA, it's true in Phoenix, all the way up and down the coast. That's how it's supposed to be. Anyhow, 2 stops up and down was Twin Dolphin Drive. 2 stops down was the old headquarters that Tripp had at
600 Galveston Drive,
right,
which is where I worked for Epic's, the same building.
Right. So we had the experience of kind of seeing video game dev Hollywood for what it was, for that little corner of it. I mean, it always had like Seattle, LA, a little bit of Texas, a little bit of the old Boston scene, a little bit of North Carolina. But the Bay Area was a pretty important hub because we had the Sega HQ there. We had the Sony HQ up in Foster City. So it was a little bit like Hollywood history, how you kind of had in the 20s, you kind of had like the big studios, and then you had the smaller studios, and the 101 corridor in the 90s, at least in my mind, kind of felt like that in terms of like Studio Row, whatever that was in Hollywood history.
Yeah, it was certainly a center. I mean, that's why I moved to California from Chicago in '83.
Right.
It was a place to be.
Well, Chicago, that's also an important subtle historical point in terms of the gaming industry, is that it really was in Chicago with Williams and Bally, and it really was an outgrowth of, economically, of that old business, which of course 50 years ago was incredibly mobbed up. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. All of the best stuff in American culture was pretty much created by organized crime. And in the entirety of our industry, it's definitely no exception to that.
Yeah, I thought you were hearing what we used to talk about.
I wanted this to be entertaining.
Pretty candid look at the 2 Matts, thinking, or whatever. We're trying to explain ourselves and the world to one another. But, what else? So eventually the M2 did sell $100 million.
That's right, to Matsushita, right?
To Matsushita. Yeah, Matsushita, which is Panasonic, etc. Techniques. They paid $100 million.
Makers of the T1200, right? That's Techniques, right?
The SL1200.
The SL1200.
Yep. So that was a huge payday. It kept 3DO alive. So it was a good investment of their money in developing that demo title, M2 Football, at Condor. But it was not completed, and it was eventually canceled. I've left 3DO, and I had already seen Diablo under development, of course. I visited while Diablo was underway, and I said, wow, this game looks incredible. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. And then I knew it was going to be a hit, of course. I just had that feeling.
As did Bob Davidson. He knew it was going to be a hit, too?
Yeah, everybody who saw it at that point knew that this thing was going to be huge. The Diablo BattleNet system made it immense by providing free online gameplay.
Well, we were really in a sweet spot with Windows 95 too, as well. Is that it was kind of like
Windows 95 sampler disk as one of the 10 samples, and then at that point, everybody knew it was going to be a hit because you got to play like 10 minutes of the first act or something. I forget.
Yeah, I think that was the original demo.
And then
with just one character, right?
Yes.
Did we just give him the melee guy?
I think it was, yeah.
The warrior.
The warrior.
Yeah.
Whatever. I can't remember what he was called. It was obviously going to be huge. I quit 3DO. I was gone. And I was looking for another job. So this was in late '96, and finally, I kept pestering Max, saying, hey, Max, can I work? Now, it was now Blizzard North because Knowledge Adventure had acquired Blizzard.
Right.
I mean, had acquired Condor and renamed them Blizzard North.
Was that very beginning in 1996 that
It
Davidson
was like-
bought him out?
No, it was,
Or was it
like,
earlier than
It was
that?
like June 96.
June 96, okay.
Something like that. I can't remember exactly. But, and then, so finally Max offered me a job. It was December of 96. There were like 2 weeks left in the development cycle
Right.
of Diablo 1. And they set me down and I was in charge of basically proofreading and fixing all the quest dialogue and getting the scrolling speeds right so that your experience in the quests was a much better experience, like
Right.
polishing those quests and the quest content, the writing.
Which is
Making sure-
a big part of your job in D2 as well,
And
was
that's-
being the
yeah, what I did in
content
Diablo
cop
2.
for story and,
I was in charge of quests and
Right.
quest development. And I did much of the writing in Diablo 2, as it turned out later. Anyway, I became in those 2 weeks, I was playing, Diablo, 12 hours a day, constantly iterating on the quests. I became an expert on the Diablo universe and the Diablo quest experience.
and there was already, that early we already had, and it still has not happened, but weren't people trying to do movie treatments like way back in like 97 already? I remember like a script, I mean, in terms of keeping an eye on the IP as a whole, that was kind of your job as well. And there was...
Yeah, but that was more under the control of the Blizzard Irvine
Right.
office. They were the holders of the reins on the Hollywood connection.
Right.
But yeah, we were in San Mateo at this point. Moved up to Campus Drive.
Well, we moved up to campus. We were still in the marina in 97. We didn't move to Campus Drive till 99.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. We were in the marina until like January 1999, I think.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And then we moved and that office actually, which was the second office we were in, was Jaron Lanier's office in the 80s. And I only discovered that because looking onto the phone switcheroo thing in the closet there, he had his... Anybody remember, what was Jaron Lanier's company in the 80s? You guys know your old VR hype 30 years ago? Okay. Well, he was there in the marina in that office. Back when virtual reality was first kind of a media phenomenon in like 89, 88. He was kind of the guy with the big thick dreadlocks that was the VR visionary that a lot of like pieces were written about in that time. And that was where he was in that office before we were, by like 5 years.
Yeah, interesting. Side note. There's a lot of elbows rubbing in Silicon Valley at that time, entertainment-wise. But we got to wrap up what we're setting the groundwork for so we can get some questions.
Oh, wait, 5 more minutes? Should I
5 more minutes.
Should I rant about early Diablo history for 5 minutes and then we'll do Q&A?
Sure.
I feel like we only got to like 97 or 98 there.
Yeah, Matt worked on all the Diablos, right? Diablo 1, Diablo
Yeah.
2, Diablo 3, doing
Sort of Diablo 3. I don't know. Should I go straight to the Diablo 3 to the 2004 juicy stuff? Is that what you guys want? I don't know. Yeah? Should I skip the 90s? No 90s?
Yeah, just
All right. Let me do this before we leave the 90s. I want to say, I just review the business history of who owned us and when. Okay. We had Walter Forbes, we had Henry Silverman, and then later on we had, in the backstory, Edgar Bronfman arguing with Jean-Marie Messier over who owned a Rothko, right? In terms of like the characters that owned, in the golden age of the games that you guys mostly know and love, we had such a crazy set of CEOs at the top, including Walter Forbes, who after, on his third trial by the feds, was finally sentenced to, 14 years? I remember the number that when Walter Forbes was sentenced, it was very close to my total time working for Blizzard. It was about 15 years that he was sentenced to federal prison. And Walter Forbes was the CEO for the Sentence scandal, which was the biggest stock scandal at the time. Walter Forbes was the CEO of the overarching company of Blizzard North at the time that we made those classics. So the public didn't hear all that much of it because this is kind of boring inside baseball stuff, I guess. But the fact that we survived from Diablo and were able to make Diablo 2, and that team was kind of made it through that period at all, was kind of miraculous, and that we had the biggest stock scandal in history at that point in the middle of that whole story. So a lot of the history of Blizzard was kind of keeping things afloat and kind of like sane and keeping the team's morale kind of going okay while all those events happened between like 97 and really even like Vivendi had like cops ended up like going into Jean-Marie Messier's office at some point and investigating him and whatnot. So we kind of had corporate scandal at the very, very top, and we were always the steady money makers that were like the nicest part of the conglomerate in all these corporate entities that were often.
Blizzard was always for sale, or always on the...
Well, we got some stability. We had some stability under the French. When Vivendi finally owned us, or it was Havas technically first, it was a little more stable.
Yeah.
I guess that goes. That bridges to the really juicy 2004 stuff. The idea that Diablo III was shut down by Vivendi is asinine. You got to think from the perspective of what really went on there. WoW was released in November 2004 or 2005. I always mix that up. 2004, right? Yeah. WoW was released in November 2004, and it instantly was the most profitable title in entertainment industry history. The margins, it was like Philip Morris times 10 in terms of like the sub base was like $1 million or $2 million off the bat, and they just kept on climbing and climbing. And so the idea that the French, after all their scandal with Messier and whatnot, would go to Orange County and tell Mike Morhaime how to run his business is the most ridiculous thing that I've ever heard in my life. It's like some venture capitalist trying to tell like the offensive line coach how to like recruit SEC kids. You know, it would never happen because it violates every common sense principle of business. So the idea, I really hate that Wikipedia narrative that the original iteration of Diablo III was shut down by Vivendi, and you blame the overseas corporate suits, because it's always easy to blame overseas businessmen instead of the mistakes and the fallibility here in the good old USA of the decisions that we make. And that's kind of one case, I think, in terms of thinking that Vivendi wanted to shut it down for whatever reason. That's absurd, especially if you know how strong the personality is of Mike Morhaime, who I personally like. So just to clear that up in terms of the juicy 2004 stuff, a lot of the Blizzard games of that period, really of the entirety of Blizzard history, I think Mike froze them or kind of suspended them or shut them down for very good reason, and almost all the time he was right. And when you look at the overarching part of Blizzard history, generally the fact that they made Overwatch after I had left and it was such a polished, successful game, that shows that they really were still kind of on their game and making generally good development decisions through most of that history. As much as I might seem like the most unlikely person in the world to be a Blizzard apologist in that sense, I think generally the decisions that Mike made in that period were good ones in terms of what he did. I don't know, we're at Q&A time already, right?
Yeah, we can just see what kind of questions, open it up for questions. I see someone over here on the far left.
Yeah, we're in Portland, and I'm kind of a lefty myself.
So a lot of these classic games, you go back and play them, and there are pieces of it that still really work and pieces of it that don't so much anymore. But Diablo II seems like one of those games where everything just meshes together in a way that's extremely satisfying. Matt, I heard you say that everyone working on it at the time felt like they knew it was going to be a hit. Was that part of it? Did it feel as it was being designed that pieces were just coming together?
I think he was talking more about like 1996 as Diablo, the original one, was coming together, but that can apply to both.
Yeah. Well, we knew Diablo 2. Diablo 2 had a particular challenge in that it needed to be better than Diablo in some ways. It needed to be bigger and better and make more money. And, it needed, and the way it did that was through three things I think really did it. And one was the skills system, which was something I believe that Steve Hedlund and Eric Schaefer put together.
Yeah, Steve Hedlund and Eric Schaefer are probably the two.
The skills,
And yourself. You had something to do with it.
Well, not me so much, but maybe a little. But
Eric is a really low-key guy, but he's a very talented designer, and he's a big part of why, when you've played, including with Rebel Galaxy out right now, there's a lot of Eric Schaefer in the background for probably why Rebel Galaxy is a worthy, fun, good value thing to pick up.
And that's the seamless exterior world, where instead of being stuck in a town and you went down into a ground, where you could kind of just randomly go everywhere.
Until Treehead Woodfist chases you down and bashes your brains in, yes.
Yeah, and that's Days of Brevik, pretty much,
Right.
I would say. That's the dynamic random level generation system carried to its extreme, and being able to sync that across, local instances and four players through client server on the internet was pretty amazing. It wasn't client server, it was client. Well, it was a server. By Diablo II, we had.
I am the
we had a
absolute
server
worst
that-
person to ask about.
We had a
about
server that
that stuff.
kept track of things. But
I mean, we can go back to Mike and Pat in terms of the
Yeah.
real roots of referencing Mike O'Brien and Pat Wyatt in terms of the guys that helped assemble the tech that was the original BattleNet.
yeah, and I think the third thing that made Diablo II better than Diablo was what I call robotronics, which is the ability to kind of run one way and shoot another. I'm a big fan of Robotron, the coin op from the early 80s. And,
As is the unfairly demonized Jay Wilson.
anyway, so, yeah. Question here.
Yeah, if Blizzard decides to continue the Diablo stories, would you guys join the team again to help out with that?
That would be that's not in the near future plans at all for me. Right now I'm salaried. I'm working with Max still on Torchlight Frontiers right now, which is a really exciting project. So I have absolutely no idea what my future holds like 5 years from now, but that's not something that's going on in the near future for me.
And I don't make a living in the game business anymore.
I never say never though.
I might, again, I'm not sure. I might go into retro game development. I used to write code on the ColecoVision. I did the Coleco conversion of Moon Patrol.
That's right.
That finally came out. Atari went bankrupt while they were deciding whether to publish that in 1984. But CollectorVision brought out a version of it a few years ago.
Okay.
So it's available. But I kind of thinking about it again. Maybe I should do something on the ColecoVision where I can do all the art and the sound and the program and the game design all myself. Maybe with some help. Oh yeah, over here. Sorry, I can't see very well.
Yeah, I had a question like, when you said you were going through a lot of the quests, testing and stuff,
Yeah.
who was instrumental in making like the characters that really made the game great, like the Butcher, Rocket
That's a great question.
Matt
You know,
before that.
the great thing about Diablo and Diablo 2 is that
when you hear that, it comes out and you're like, oh yes!
a lot of why Diablo and Diablo 2 were entertaining and worked was because they're created by people that really were not professionals in terms of our background. And so when you saw these characters that were created by guys like Eric Sexton or Kelly Johnson, they weren't kind of boxed off by just being animators or just being designers. A lot of those characters like Decker Kane, like the Butcher, were really kind of labors of love of really idiosyncratic individuals. And I think that is kind of why it's one of the reasons that those two games still have big appeal and a lot of nostalgia for folks right now, is I think that kind of personal attachment to the creation it gets rarer and rarer as gaming gets more specialized, as people are more either designers or animators. In terms of the backstory with Kelly Johnson, one thing I got to mention is that Decker Kane was created by a black artist as a black character. And to me, I don't think the cinematics team that was in charge of that IP I don't think they were racist at all, and they're actually a very diverse group of guys. But it's an interesting example in terms of the way a character, somehow Decker Kane in 1996 went from being a black dude to being a white dude in like 2010 or whatever. I don't know exactly how that happened. It's interesting that it did happen. Kelly also created the Paladin, and I feel like that character was a lot of aspects of that character was a function of him being more than an artist, and really kind of that character class was his baby, and him really understanding the game dynamics behind it. And I think that's generally true, and that a lot of the things that people love about those two games was the personal attachment of particular artists and designers to making them get across something in the flavor of the character, and most importantly in the flavor of the game experience. We were all genuinely nerdy types that actually liked to play the game, and that was, you don't always get that in shows.
That's Blizzard's secret of the success at the time, of course.
Well, a lot of QA too.
Obsessive QA,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
playing.
Mike really understood that early, and when I moved to Irvine after Blizzard North was shut down in 2005, and I saw the night shift come in for the QA team there. They had like maybe 40 or 50 people. They were full-time employees. They'd have a day shift, and then they'd have a night shift. And when I saw them come in around 5 p.m., I was like, this is the real reason that Blizzard has been as successful as it is, because there's a lot of like creative people in the industry with a lot of great ideas, a lot of passion for games. But what Mike did was he really kind of industrialized the process in terms of taking QA very seriously and seeing QA as like a 24-hour thing with like a full crew around the clock. And that's a big part of why WoW was so successful, is that when you played a Blizzard product, you could kind of be assured that QA was rock solid. As much as we remember the charming, idiosyncratic moments, that basic quality control, I think, was the number one thing in those titles.
I think we have 5 minutes left. Any more questions?
We got
This gentleman
gentleman
in
over
red on the right.
I know it's not a 3DO panel, but I'm interested in the fact, you work on the game too.
Oh, yeah.
I was curious, was it ever going to actually be an add-on? Because it advertises that.
Oh, as a
uh,
plug-in add-on for the
it was
for the multiplayer?
Because they had the 3DO.
I don't know.
Don't be a dodo, or don't play a dodo thing, saying that all the, Sega, Genesis, and Super Nintendo, you're going to have to replace them, and they were marketing.
Right. Well, didn't Matsushita see it as like the guts of a new console potentially? Wasn't that the concept, kind of?
Yeah, I believe Matsushita was going to release it as a separate console, but they may have planned some kind of plug-in adapter for the original.
Matsushita was always kind of low profile here, but they had the money and muscle to have tried to launch a console if they'd wanted to, circa like 98, 99, to seriously consider the idea.
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
They didn't.
Which not everybody does.
succeed. Yeah. So another question right here. This gentleman.
The Diablo soundtrack is one of my favorites, and it's
Thanks.
I feel like as good as it is unique. It doesn't really remind me of much, and so I'm really curious what inspirations went into it, because I do think it's very unique.
When I listen to it, I hear a lot of like a lot of Bauhaus. I hear some Led Zeppelin. I didn't directly riff off Pink Floyd as an influence, but it's obviously there in terms of like the whiny guitar thing that David Gilmour does. Actually, he both does the 12-string and the whiny steel thing. So it's all kind of, it's a mishmash. I think a lot of the aesthetic I absorbed growing up was when I was like 12, 13, 14, I was in LA during the kind of K-rock glory years. And so I think I'm a little more open-minded about that kind of post-punk, dub reggae-ish stuff that always kind of crept around the edges in that era. So that kind of made me a little bit less of a straight-up rocker or straight-up classical guy in my influences. My folks always dragged me to a lot of classical stuff too, so that was always kind of in my background. And I still don't see any, and this is true of the best musicians I've worked with, they don't really see a barrier in their mind between classical and jazz and rock. So I think being open-minded about that helps in terms of whatever worked there.
Another question? This gentleman here.
This is kind of a fun question. So you said you used to work for Activision,
Yes, I did.
and you still have a couple shares of the stock left.
Oh, yes.
Well, how much do you think they're worth now?
Well,
This is a funny question. Just kind of answer it, and then I'll give you the question. What I
Cool.
was
I don't know if
They're
if that's the same thing as
probably
it's a
not.
current
Okay, well, what I was getting
ATVI.
at was, why don't you autograph them, bring them here and auction.
They're probably worth
I
more.
bet you get $1,000 or more for them.
I don't know if I don't think it's like a Berkshire Hathaway thing where
Well,
you
they
got a couple
keep
shares of Warren
trying to
Buffett.
get me to turn them into to a broker so that they don't have to send me the.
Right. It's just a paperwork.
Well, I'd be willing to
the
buy
checks
one for
each year
$500
for
with an
dividends.
autograph because Kaboom is my favorite Activision game.
Oh.
Kaboom was a mouse. You couldn't really. The thing is, Kaboom was one of those games where you needed a dial. It was like a breakout style game, right?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, that was kind of a mini. That was a niche of that world. The thing is, if you didn't have one of those rotating paddles, it was kind of lame. It's a lame joystick game, right?
But I remember when the commercials were on television when it was first coming out.
Right. Kaboom was 83, 84?
Something like that.
Yeah. That was you have a dial and is the guy dropping bombs on you or are you dropping the bombs? I forget.
He's dropping the bombs and you have 3 buckets of water to catch him in, and every time you miss.
Right. It's
one
almost
bucket
a missile command variation, really.
in a way.
With the paddle.
yes.
Yeah.
But it's basically a guy trying to escape from prison.
Right. Which of course is where all the Bethesda games start that way. Great trope.
Another question?
One more question.
Back here on the aisle. Yeah.
My question is about the Diablo I soundtrack.
Yes.
In songs like Caves,
Yes.
the vocalizations in there, like the guy moaning. I was wondering if there were any fun stories or who did that.
You know, the crying baby, I think, is just a Hollywood Edge sound effect. I did try to, a big part of the charm of the Diablo 1 soundtrack is that I recorded it all in a pretty garbagey way, and it was reproduced at just 22K mono, which is horrible. And so it kind of like feels warm and mysterious. Yeah, I think in today's kind of hyper clean world, we don't really keep things kind of murky and dirty. And I was all about in that era just smudging with things in SoundForge and doing random stuff to them that I had no interest in really reproducing or knowing exactly what I was doing. So it was kind of I think that mindset helped make it entertaining. I hope. A lot of it was just random sound effect stuff that I would take from like stock libraries.
Well, I think we've run out of time for our scheduled talk, but we're going to be signing autograph or whatever.
We
can go to this autograph room next door and you can ask more questions.
Are they giving us the hook, or can we take like one or two? We probably get the hook. Huh?
Unfortunately, we are a minute past and we have to get the next panel in.
Yeah. So you're all welcome to come ask us more things in a round robin way or whatever.
Yeah, I wish I could do another hour. Thank you.